Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I wanted to share with you this morning some work that we've been doing that we've been calling Leave No Country Behind. It's obviously a play on this concept of leave no one behind. But what we wanted to emphasize is that actually we haven't yet managed to even start that process by leaving no country behind. The premise is that if some countries fall behind, it's very difficult for anybody living in those places to actually achieve what we want, which is the eradication of hunger, of poverty. So, I wanted to start this by saying, in the MDGs, and as we said, we had this terrific achievement of actually managing to reduce global poverty by half. But when we did that, it happened through progress in a few very large countries, mostly in Asia. So one can think of China and India and Indonesia. One can think of Bangladesh. Vietnam is not on that list, but should be, even in places like Ethiopia. All of that happened in a context where, at least in some places, there was absolutely minimal progress. And one of the big changes from the MDGs to the SDGs is that with the SDGs, with this emphasis on eradicating poverty, we can't leave any places behind. So a question is, so which places are there that we should now focus on where if we don't make some difference from the way in which we were approaching development before, we will simply have no chance of ending poverty there and achieving the SDGs. And that's really what I wanted to talk about. We have called these places severely off-track countries. And it's a very simple concept. One could think of many ways of identifying countries where progress hasn't been made, and people have often talked about fragile states. Fragility is a concept which I think is, first of all, quite subjective, and there are now several definitions of fragility, and they encompass a large range of different circumstances and situations. And so it's lost a little bit of its operational meaning. So instead, we took something which I would argue is more results-focused. We simply looked at 195 countries across the world. We did some projections of where they were, reasonably likely to end up in terms of poverty, and said, let's look at all those countries where poverty headcount rates would end up by 2030 under current business as usual practices of being over 20%. That's already a fairly generous threshold. It's nowhere near 0%, which is what we would like to get to if we're actually going to end poverty. But at least it's a percentage. If you're above that, there is no chance you would be able to say, this is a place where we have ended poverty. So we looked at that, and we arrived at a list of about 31 countries, and this map shows you where those countries are. What you see is that they are, by and large, more and more concentrated in Africa. Here is the composition of our notion of severely off-track countries compared to fragile states. The World Bank has a definition of fragile states. The OECD has a definition of fragile states. There's a great deal of overlap, but crucially, it's not exactly the same. We looked at these severely off-track countries and essentially asked the question, what are the great obstacles to development? Why are these countries off-track? And we looked at four different types of challenges that these places face. We looked at government effectiveness. So government effectiveness, many people talk about weak states, they talk about corruption, and that top circle that you see encompasses all the countries with low government effectiveness. But there's also an element of obstacles which is on the private sector. We heard in the introductory messages this morning about the real importance of creating jobs and private sector development, creating economic growth in many of these places. And what we see is the policy environment for the private sector is very weak in a number of these places. Then we looked at what is often called fragility, which is conflict and violence, and there are these metrics of how many deaths per are being recorded in a country population. That, again, includes a large number of countries. And then finally, we looked at the risk of people being impacted by natural disasters of one kind or another. When you put all of these together, what you see is that these different countries actually mostly sit in at least one, but usually two and sometimes even three of these different kinds of challenges. And the rationale behind organizing countries in this way is to try to say that the priorities for many of these countries are going to be different depending on where they are. And in fact, interestingly, there are some countries, 3 in our structure, that aren't affected by any of these at all, which raises the question, so why is there not progress in these countries? What I want to emphasize here is that it's too easy to just dismiss these countries as being hopeless places with, weak and corrupt governments where nothing can be done. That is a road which is probably inaccurate, because what we see is that there are plenty of places with exactly those same characteristics where things can be done. The challenge in these places seems instead to be that there are overlapping obstacles, and anybody who tries to take a strategy that focuses on one without addressing the other ends up then running into some further obstacles, and you don't get sustained development over time. Hence, you tend to get, in many of these places, something which is now a common descriptor, which is short periods of development progress, but then followed by development regress, and then when you look over a long period of time, no net progress. So these are the places where we have not had significant poverty reduction in the past, and we aren't likely to get them in the next few years. Let me say now a few words about each of these challenges. I'll start with low government effectiveness, because this is often where people put the focus, but only something like half of the countries that we're talking about fall into the bottom 1/3 of all developing countries in these metrics of low government effectiveness. This is a metric that comes from the Economist Intelligence Unit on state capacity. So, this is not just about can governments actually administer, enforce rules, deliver services, the things we're used to thinking about in terms of weak states, but in half of these places it is. How do you actually improve government effectiveness? A lot of the things we've tried don't work terribly well. I mean, we've tried a lot of capacity development. You go off and you do some training courses, and it doesn't really seem to have achieved the kind of improvement in state capacity that we all would hope for. And this idea that you can just take institutions, sometimes from Western countries, you say, well, it's worked here, so it should work there, and somehow translate those institutions into completely different contexts. I think we've now understood that that is unlikely to be a good way forward. And instead, people are talking much more about experimentation, about adaptive approaches, about starting to build up from local government capacities, and having, at the same time, national plans, local government implementation projects, building bridges between those two. And of course, we have the perennial problem of how do you actually balance between getting something done which is absolutely necessary because we're often talking about actually saving lives during this period versus having enough time for experimentation and learning and adaptation. And that's a very fine balance that I think needs to be tackled. Then let's talk about the private sector. It's really interesting to me how little attention the private sector has received in many of these countries in the past discourse. And yet when we looked at this, this is far and away the principal challenge to development in these places. And this is, again, I want to emphasize, this is the policy environment. And 22 of our 31 severely off-track countries have quite weak private sector environments. And when you talk to people, what is it about these environments that you see as being so weak? They say it's political instability, it's electricity, and it's corruption. Actually, on at least two of these, the electricity and the corruption part, we have quite good ideas about what can be done. And on electricity, we have very good ideas about what can be done. We don't actually do some of these very basic things in some of these places. And that's a little bit of a question for us as to exactly how do we think about the private sector and how we're going to try to address it. It comes a little bit into this question of what do we think about informal firms versus formal firms. Very often when we talk about building up the private sector, we're actually talking about formal businesses that pay wages and are, formally constituted, etc. That's a tiny fraction of the businesses that actually exist in most of these places. Most of them are informal. And then you have questions, well, what's our strategy? Is our strategy, is it to try to get these informal places to become formalized? And they often resist it because they don't want to pay taxes, they don't want to really interface with governments because these are places with weak governments, etc. Or are we simply trying to encourage more informal sector activity until we get enough of a momentum of private sector growth that we really have some development progress? Again, there's now new experimentation. In the replenishment of IDA 18, there was the creation of a special window where there are financial resources that are available to de-risk private sector activity in fragile states. I'm going to argue a little bit later that maybe the issue is not actually de-risking, because the work that we've done suggests that the financial performance is just as good in fragile states as in non-fragile states. The real issue is the size of projects tends to be much smaller. Businesses, the size tends to be much smaller, transaction costs are much larger, and so it's just not worthwhile, especially for foreign investors, sending people, establishing a plant somewhere because there are fixed costs of undertaking that kind of activity, and then you end up with actually fairly small market sizes and small markets that you can really make money off. Conflict and violence. I think it's not a secret that we're not going to have development if we continue to have conflict. I think that we have to recognize how destructive conflict really is. In short periods of time, there are countries that can lose half of their national income, 1/3 of their national income. It's not uncommon. These are very, very big changes. So if we are going to have any hope of reaching the SDGs, we have to do a much better job in trying to stop the recurring cycle of conflict and violence that we see in many countries in 12 of our 31 severely off-track countries. Ending conflict is obviously not an easy matter, but one of the things I would say is that in the development space, there are some things that we think of as being quite essential to conflict reduction, in particular having a reasonably effective police force, having a well-functioning judiciary, things like that. These are heavily underinvested in by the development community. The multilateral development banks really don't want to go into this space because it's thought to be too political for them, and in their charters, they are encouraged to avoid political activities. A few bilateral donors move into this space, but it's very ad hoc. So you can't say, if you're a country and you say, one of the things I absolutely need is, okay, the military solution is over, but we've still got to have, a certain reasonable police force. Who do I turn to for major support in this area? There's no easy answer for that. It's, in my view, a big missing link in terms of the development architecture that we currently have. Natural hazards and environmental risks, there are now so many stories and examples of how many of the things that end up in conflict or in other issues start with some kind of natural disasters. I think there was a really useful report that was written by the United Nations and the World Bank that said we don't actually experience natural disasters, we experience natural hazards. They're made into disasters usually by the response of governments or the inability of governments to respond. And that's why you see that it's in poor countries that the number of people impacted by these is so much larger than it is in rich countries. There are these various international frameworks for trying to deal and address with natural disasters. The Hyogo Framework for Action, very few of the countries that we're talking about that are really at risk actually have good resilience plans and have really integrated that into their development frameworks. And that's one of the things that probably has to be paid much more attention to by the donor community. There are other things that we've talked about before. I think that there's now a recognition that using cash as a response in humanitarian crises can, in some instances, be more effective than actually delivering services themselves. That's starting to take hold. All of these, I think, are examples of how we have to teach communities to be more resilient themselves. What can we do? What kind of action plans need to be put in place? First, donors as a group don't put too much of their money into these places. It's about $20 billion out of net ODA of 130 billion that we're talking about in country programmable aid, which is a different version of the aid that actually reaches developing countries. It's probably somewhere slightly above 100 billion these days. So we're talking about between a fifth to a quarter of the total amounts of aid actually going to the countries which are facing the biggest challenges. There has to be a discussion about whether this is the right amount or not. We've all got our views and opinions on this, but if you really believe this is where the front line of the battle against ending poverty is going to be, putting a quarter of your resources there, in my view, is probably not the right answer. As I said, one of the really interesting things is that aid projects tend to do just as well in these places as they do in other places. So it's not a function of the fact that you can't achieve things. You actually can. And Jan made this point in his remarks. We should not leave here with the idea that things are hopeless in these places. Individual projects are successful. The problem is, how do we get those individual projects to be successful, not just in the project area, but in achieving transformation in the countries as a whole? And we think that there are three ways of doing this. They're going to be called, we're calling them reimagining scaling up, redefining country ownership, and rethinking what is a current, I think, somewhat fad of the donor community, which is results-focused metrics, which in my view is also a way of saying short-term thinking, because we can only measure results in the short run. And for many of these places, we need to have much longer run time horizons. So on scaling up, and I'm going to go very fast through these. Usually you think about scaling up as either being scaling up by governments of government programs or scaling up by businesses of things, think energy, where businesses might be able to find profitable ways of doing business and then really take it to scale. In the places we're talking about, both of those kinds of pathways are blocked. You have weak private sector environments, as I said, and weak state capacities. How do you actually build those pathways? I think one thing to do is to really focus on this notion of transactions costs. Very often it's just the putting together of projects that's the difficult part. It's expensive. They're operating at relatively small scales. We don't have platforms that are scalable. So I think that for all aid agencies, if you want to think catalytic, get rid of the word catalytic and substitute the idea of scalable platforms. What are the kinds of things that can be scaled? And if something can't be scaled, then even if it's a success, it's not going to have impact. On country ownership, we do need to understand that we've talked about it for a very long time. We haven't really put it into practice. It's still just words, and for most donors, they still have parallel systems. They don't use country systems. That's because they don't trust those country systems. And that's not terribly surprising because they're not very good. That's why we talk about these as being places that are really hard for development to take root. So you shouldn't say, well, until that happens, we're simply going to develop our own processes. You've got to invest in these processes and invest in country systems. In my mind, that means doing a great deal more with public financial management in some of these places. I think that there are some really useful experiences across the world which have worked quite well. I've mentioned here Liberia, but also in Afghanistan and other places. They all revolve around much stronger country partnerships, which do provide governments a little bit of space to experiment, implement policy, but really ultimately take charge of their own development. If we don't insist on that and really build it into all of the activities, we really, I think, have little hope for getting to where we want to get to by 2030. And finally, this notion of results-focused metrics. I mean, we're talking about places where, as I said, you get development surges and then you get these big regressions. So looking at the short run of what kinds of results are we achieving is very unlikely to get you very far. We have to think about results over a much longer time frame. We're talking about 2030. That period was deliberately chosen as a way of lengthening government's horizons because you have to build systems and give systems time to work. And that means that you have to think about some quite different kinds of indicators. There is some research that suggests that if you have indicators about the autonomy of field officers, about their ability and flexibility to operate, about their ability to respond quickly to shocks, those kinds of indicators are likely to be much more significant in thinking about their effectiveness than it is to actually try to measure what we normally would think of in development cooperation as being results or outcomes. And as you do that, you'll start to understand that the process of monitoring is not about evaluating how good were things before. It has to be about actually getting real-time feedback to improve what you're doing today. And what that means is you don't wait until a project is finished, then do an evaluation, which is another 1 or 2 years later, and then think about how to change. You're actually doing something which is much closer to a business process, which is putting in place metrics and systems that allow you to say month to month or week to week, this is how we have to be changing and improving what we're doing. So let me end by saying, we're moving from this sort of period in history where we had poverty concentrated in these large Asian economies. That's sort of been taken off the table. There are a number of smaller countries, although some of these are not that small. I mean, we're also talking about Nigeria and DRC. These are, quite big places. Let me not overstate this case. But we're talking about a limited number of countries where for long periods of time there has been very little real development progress, certainly on the poverty front, and the prospects going forward also don't look so good. These should be the focus of our activity, and we should identify them and pay far more political attention to them and measure ourselves not by global results, but by results that are being achieved in these places, because this is the frontier. I think this is where success or failure of the development enterprise should be measured. So we're calling these kinds of places severely off-track countries. There are things that we know that have been successful in these places, so we shouldn't fall into the trap of just saying this is all hopeless and nothing can be done because these places are just basket cases. That doesn't square with the empirical evidence that we have. And the big challenge that we have in these places is how do we take those kinds of successes that we see at the micro level and turn them into truly transformational change at the country level. Thank you very much.